Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Resilient Riches. Today, we have a special treat of Paul Robinson, who is the entrepreneurial story of what every lawyer should actually dream to be. He's been interim CEO of hugely publicly traded companies. He's been the strategic lawyer for billionaires. I think it's 4 billionaires already you told me, Paul. But if you want to learn anything about how to take your practice from just being a traditional lawyer working in big law or just being a cog in the wheel and then becoming an entrepreneur, owning equity in amazing companies and changing the world with everything and everything that you've done, you're going to listen to this episode. We're going to give a lot of insight. Paul has an incredible story from his background, which is very similar to ours, and to his going through cancer and what's gone through his life and his amazing family. Paul, really excited to have this conversation. Thanks so much for coming on. It's long waited.
Thank you. Best intro I think I've ever got.
Good. Jen gives you good intros. So, Paul, can you give the listeners a few minutes of your background, and then we'll go right into how you've got this success so quickly?
Sure. I'm not sure about how quick, but yes. I grew up on Long Island, and I went to SUNY Binghamton for undergrad. My parents had to declare personal bankruptcy while I was in high school, so I paid for undergrad, and I started my first few businesses in undergrad. I was pre-med, but then I got sued in connection with one of those businesses, and in defending that case, which I ultimately won, I decided to change my major and became a poli-sci major and decided to go to law school. Not knowing much about law, but knowing that I signed a contract that I didn't have any idea what it meant. And then I went to law school at BU. And when I graduated, I did what a lot of young lawyers did. It was a tough time. It was 92. It was the first time in history where law firms were actually closing. There was a few big ones, one in particularly in Boston. And so I worked at a large firm for my first 18 months. And then I went to an even larger firm after that for a few years in DC. And then after I paid off my student loans from undergrad and law school, I asked an attorney, it was Bob Bennett, who was Clinton's attorney while I was at Skadden, what do you do next? You know, I don't want to stay as an associate for the rest of my life and hope I make partner. So he suggested I go into the Senate onto a special investigation. I got very lucky. There was one that came up. It was the special investigation into campaign finance under Senator Thompson. I did that for a year. I learned that I absolutely hate politics, but I got a really great experience. He was, Bob was right about one thing, which is that in the government, you will get a ton more experience than maybe you even should. After a year of doing that and the investigation concluded, I went back to New York. I worked at a firm called Kramer Levin for a year. And it was there that I decided that I started to get very involved with some of my clients. And eventually one of them made an offer for me to come in-house. I was a litigator, so that's unusual, but I made an effort, as we'll talk later, to expand beyond my litigation background. And when I went in-house after a couple of years, I was made general counsel. This is one of the largest Israeli companies at the time. That had some interesting issues that happened to it with regard to the senior management in terms of stock option backdating, where I lost my CEO, my CFO, and most of my board of directors. And then I was interim chief CEO, but it wasn't CEO, principal executive officer. I didn't want to be CEO. And we eventually hired a new CEO, and then I left there and I went down to Florida for a company called Secor, where I was general counsel. And I've been general counsel for a variety of different companies. And then about 8 years ago, I made the decision that I don't want to work for one company anymore. And I was debating even whether I'd retire. But ultimately, I had a network of private equity companies that I had done work with. And so what I've been doing for the last 8 years is working with private equity, and I become either outside general counsel or actual general counsel or interim general counsel for their portfolio companies. And I work on a retainer basis, not an hourly basis. and I will go in and either fix the legal operations and make them more organized and efficient, or and then hand it off to a GC we hire, or I'll continue to do the GC work on a contracted basis. And oftentimes I take equity in these companies because that's where the real money is. And so that's a very short summary of my history.
My dad tells his background in about 30. He has also a long background, but he tells it in real time. So thank you for abridging the version in about 2 days.
I don't want to lose anyone this early in the
No. But the point that I think you're making is that you went to so many different avenues, and that made you a much better lawyer. But is that traditional in law to do all these different things and be successful? I mean, it sounds like people kept reaching out to you to work to do their legal work. Is that very common?
In the beginning, what I would tell young attorneys is, like, if you're a litigator, raise your hand to go to that deposition that no one wants to go to in the middle of nowhere. Okay. Take on the responsibility. I did a pro bono trial when I was a young attorney, which taught me a ton about trying a case that I would have never had the opportunity to learn, because no client wants a second year trying their case, you know? But once you've done it, then when you raise your hand next time, they'll ask who's taken a deposition or who's argued a motion. And when you're able to say you did, then it just starts rolling from there. And so the first thing is don't allow yourself to become overly pigeonholed. You want to become really good in your concentration. So if you're an employment lawyer, yes, you need to do a lot of employment law work, but that doesn't mean that you can't get involved in other matters and learn those skill sets, whether it be as a litigator learning securities law, or whether it's as a corporate lawyer learning the basics of litigation. Because if you're going to be a general counsel, it's exactly that. You need all those, the full panoply of skill sets. And so I would recommend in your early career volunteering for these, let's say, unsavory or less desirable cases. And then as you get older, you take those skill sets and you're able to actually put them to use. So you're not.
I imagine that's what you meant by being in Washington, because you like you probably didn't get paid a lot of money, but you were exposed to areas that the highest levels of our partners. You would in the private sector you would be doing the work, but now you're in the government, so that's what you're doing there. So that's just giving you that skill set. The same idea really is you're expanding your skill set. Really, at Washington's responsibility.
100%. So I took a tremendous pay cut, which is why I had to pay off my student loans first before I was willing to do it. The government does not pay well. But I was taking depositions of some very high level people that, we would all know the names of, at hearings, working directly with senators. And there is no, like, when you're an attorney working on an investigation, there's no where, it's not, oh, like, who has done this before? No one's done it before, probably. Okay. And you take all those skill sets and you put them to use. But now it's on a government investigation, which has, by the way, a whole area of law associated with it. I mean, there are attorneys that just defend parties or represent parties in connection with government investigations. And I almost went into that white collar space in DC. If I didn't hate politics so much, I might have, but I didn't want to do that. But it's a good skill set to have, because my clients have had government investigations and I know who to call and how to respond. And it's not the same as a private litigation at all.
Yeah, well, it shows this well-roundedness, and it leads me to my next question: is you've been the legal strategist for billionaires, and there's a lot of lawyers who want to get out of the system, the big law system, and go and be in-house and be this type of person. What was the mentality shift that you had to make, which we call it bank mentality, when you work for somebody, you do the work and you go home? What was the mentality shift when you were able to transition from big law to working in-house or being their strategist?
So my first opportunity to go in-house was I was litigating on behalf of my client. And it was a matter that was in Brazil. It was in Massachusetts state court, and it was in federal court. And that litigation impacted a variety of different aspects of their work. And so I started studying the company, not just the case. And this was telecom back in the late 90s, which was exploding. It hadn't exploded yet, but it was on the cusp. And so the company I was working with, I would often stay on the calls, and sometimes they would just ask me to stay and I'd listen, but then I would go and I'd read the 10Ks and I'd read the underlying documents, the annual reports, and I would learn a sense of the company so that I would be able to make suggestions in connection with their business in general. And then what happened is suddenly I was being invited to calls that had nothing to do with the litigation. And then they get annoyed at paying your hourly rate, so they offer you a position in-house. And my advice when you get an offer to go in-house is negotiate your equity very carefully. But there's another thing I would recommend too. Don't go too early. I can't tell you how many people I know when I was about a fourth or fifth year who left. This is right about the .com phase, left to go in-house, but never really honed their attorney skills. So they went in-house and it was very exciting. But when those companies went bust, they couldn't go back to a law firm because they'd have to go back as like a third or fourth year associate. No one was going to do that when they've been practicing for 8 years. And they weren't able to have the full set of skills to be a practicing attorney. They were quasi attorneys. And so if you're going to do this, I waited over 8 or 9 years of practicing intensely before I even considered the opportunity to go in-house. Now, some people will disagree with that and say, well, if you get an opportunity to go in-house, go ahead. Unless it's a highly specialized field, I would argue that could be a mistake.
What about, you said something about taking equity and being very careful on how you negotiate equity. You've negotiated for a living your entire life and built serious success by doing that. What is the medium between taking equity versus taking salary? Because I know a lot of companies will go, oh, here, take all the equity in the world and we won't pay you.
What do you mean? What do you mean when you say be careful? What should you be looking out for?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with one, which is kind of like a fun trick question. And I ask this of my clients. If I offered you, 100 shares at $1,000 or 1,000 shares as an option to buy at $1,000, which would you take? The answer is both. Okay. See, a lot of times companies will make a proposal and you'll be given a false choice. So it's either the equity or the salary. It's not. It's both. Now, the reality is if you don't have the leverage, you're not going to be able to negotiate too aggressively the first time. However, very often equity is a very easy thing for them to give. It doesn't, it hits the books differently. Okay. Also, bonuses hit the books differently. This is sophisticated accounting issues. You don't want things in something called the SG&A, which is the sales general administrative of companies. So when you get a salary raise, that salary raise is in the books and it affects the P&L of the company. One-time events don't. Okay. So if you can structure some of your deal to be a one-time event, it's more palatable to the CFO. Now, when it comes to equity, you want to try to get obviously as much as you can, but you need a living wage. You can't all be equity. And the problem is if the company is doing extraordinarily well right now and the equity gets, reversed, and there's a lot of companies where we could give that as an example in the AI field, they went crazy and now they're down to earth. Your equity could be worth nothing and you have to wait for another grant to get equity that could be in the money in the long run. I don't want to get too technical.
Well, the only thing I would say, one point I would say, and also I don't want to get too technical, but if you're taking it, let's say as a bonus, as a one-time charge, whatever time you get a salary raise, it's not going to be including that bonus, right? So that's a downside to doing that, just as a technical thing.
So when you get an increase in salary, your next increase is going to be off of that increased salary. That's for sure. However, I have found specifically in tech sectors that you are more likely to get a nice bonus than you are an increase in salary. So I once again, I would tell you it's both. It's not one or the other. But if you had to choose one or the other, I would take the one that gives you more money in the short term, because unless you think you're going to be at the same company for 30 years, that increased basis in your salary is not worth the offset on what you could have got on a one-time bonus. And
it's interesting though, because it really ties back to what you said before. If you're in practice longer, which will give you more leverage, then you can negotiate better. So it just makes more sense to stay as long as you can before you get lured away for that in-house opportunity. And I would say also, like, if my experience is, if you're going to get one in-house opportunity, you're going to get more. You're that type of person, and if by waiting, you can just improve your opportunities.
There are times where you'll get a unique opportunity, and once you're in the door, it's easier to leverage that to other opportunities. That's the counter argument I would make to that. So, but if you're a skilled attorney and you have a well-rounded group, company support skills, there's a sweet spot at which you can make the change, and I would say it's somewhere between your 5th and 8th year of practice. You're junior enough to really be impactful when you come over, but you're not so senior that you're going to be in a very expensive addition or threatening to an existing GC.
No, you price yourself out.
Yes.
It's interesting. We have some clients of ours that went in-house into nursing homes. They were investment bankers, but like that 5 to 8 year range, and lawyers that worked at like Ropes and Gray and other big law firms that were taken in that 5 to 8 year range, and they were taking for, let's say, $400,000, which in it's not partner level, but it's still palatable for a nursing home. And now they have these amazing pieces of talent that are in the companies. They're giving them equity. It's really, really amazing what they're doing. So it fits a lot of what people are saying. And I hope everyone's understanding what is equity versus what is actual salary, having enough, but also you don't have to necessarily put more money into your retirement if you have a good company that has good options. So you can take less money, put less into your 401k, but have options for future liquidity event that could really cover your entire retirement.
I just think also, like what you said, Paul, is like super important. Everything's negotiable. It depends on your leverage. Like, a lot of people think, oh, I can't ask for that. That's a crazy thing. No, everything. If you don't ask, you don't know. All they can do is say no.
I tell people all the time, I don't know any company that didn't engage with someone who asked thoughtful requests backed by some support. People are afraid they're going to ask for too much. I would make it clear that this is my initial ask, and they can say no, and you can say no. But as you said, if you don't ask, but you really have to be smart, look at the company's filings. You can get a sense of what the senior executives got, because that grant is listed if it's a public company. All their options and equity are easily obtained. It's all public. There's something called a Form 4, and in the proxy, in the annual report, or something called a 10-KA, all the compensation information for what they call the named executive officers are available. And while, listen, you're not going to get that level, but you can start to figure out what the parameters are.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to know what the context is. You can't ask for pie in the sky, then you'll be laughed out.
Well, yeah. I want to just break down what Paul just said so that everybody heard it. He was talking about earlier in the episode that he was looking at 10Ks and looking at these companies as their advisor. And now when he's negotiating for options for himself, he's reading the 10Ks that he already knows about and is able to actually see and what he's able to negotiate with. So he's going to see if it's a good company or not. And it really comes down to being well-rounded and understanding the financial side as well as the legal side. He understood also the political side, and he's also kind of a doctor because he went for pre-med. He started pre-med. So he has really every Jew. The only thing
I don't know if I would go to him for like a brain surgery or something.
Now maybe, but the only thing you're really missing is the engineer. You would have been the perfect Jew if you just had the engineering part of it.
What I can help you out medically is becoming a self-advocate. I can tell you that there's nothing more important than that. Your selection of doctors and your self-advocacy, but that'll be another discussion about my leukemia.
I would say though, if you're asking the company and they flip out on you and it's, it doesn't, and it's like they go crazy, maybe that's not the right company for you.
They're not going to flip out. What they'll do is say that's out of line with what we're asking. And if they really want you, they'll set it. But they're never going to say that ask alone makes me not want to engage with you.
Exactly.
I mean, that's very emotional, it's very unprofessional. But if you can explain why, let's say I say, listen, here's why I'm asking. This is what other companies grant, because you don't have to just look at your company, look at the other companies in the industry. Okay. And you can support it. They can come back and explain why they won't, but it won't be because you just asked for a number randomly. It's,
where do you see this? Where do you do this homework? Can you give our listeners actual concrete places where to look?
So sec.gov is the repository of all companies' public filings. You can also go to their website, and if it's a public company, their filings have to be on their website. It's usually in the investor section of the website. Now, if you want to learn a company, and by the way, this is good for investing advice too, by the way. If you want to learn a company, read their 10Ks and Qs. They have an area called MD&A, which is management's discussion and analysis. That is where the company has to explain its future and its strategy. Now, they're not going to give out too much because there's competitive information in there, but you'll be able to read significant litigations. They have to list them. The risk factors of the company. Some of them are generic, but some of them are very, very specific. One thing that plaintiffs' firms do is they run track changes from each quarter's forward-looking statements and risk factors, or each year. And the reason they do that is every word change can be a pretty telling thing. So if suddenly there's a risk factor in there about, securitized assets, well, then that means that it's hit a threshold of some level of materiality. Now, sometimes it's generic. For example, when COVID came out, everyone added a COVID risk factor. You had to, and that wouldn't tell you very much about the company. But the more idiosyncratic risk factors will tell you a lot. And it's just another way of getting smarter about either your industry or your client's competitor. And so it's not just about doing the work that comes in. When you ask me about how do you transition to working for very wealthy people, okay? Well, you need to identify with their interests. And their interests first are either the company they're running and things like that. But then there are ways that they want to structure things that are unusual. And after you get some experience doing it, you can speak the language of the outside law firm and be able to liaise and save a lot of time or raise questions and issues that otherwise wouldn't have been thought of. Answers are easy. This day and age with the internet and with, all sorts of different law resources, you want to find out the answer to a question, it doesn't take long. Asking the right question is the key. Because
also interpreting the answers three people could read the same thing you're reading and not see the same. And I give that to your acumen that you developed in Washington again to read between the lines in the politics. So now you're applying that to the K9s or whatever K1s you said.
10Ks and
10Ks.
You're not reading them, my dad, just so you know.
There's an S1, which is when a company files to go public. And listen, all of this sounds really, and when I was younger, I was very intimidated by it. Don't be. These are just letters. All they are is documents, and they're not that hard to read. And I didn't mean to turn it into that much of it. It really is a great way for a lawyer to learn about their clients. And I tell this to a lot of, even my outside attorneys. I'm like, have you read my last K? And if the answer is no, that's not a good answer.
That's huge. That's actually, that's enormous. You just went through a very significant event just now, physically. And you said something to me the other day that you stopped caring about everything else, and you've done a lot better because of it.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Little over 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with leukemia, and I am cancer-free for 1 year and 9 months now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's 6 months of pretty significant chemo. I had a very rare type of leukemia called ETP. And then I had a stem cell transplant. I'm also now a volunteer for Gift for Life, which is an amazing organization that encourages people to test to see if they could be a donor. And I will just say this, being a stem cell donor is not much different from being a blood donor. It sounds like it's a lot more when you hear like bone marrow transplant or something. It's a very simple thing to do. And the more young people that do it, the more lives that can be saved. That's my pitch for Gift of Life. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, when I went through my illness, the 5 stages of grief really kind of apply. You know, you have denial, you have bargaining, you have anger, and you ultimately get to acceptance. And to short circuit it, Yair, what happened is very quickly on, I came to the point that I may not make it. I don't know. The hardest part is the beginning of the treatment when you're going through some pretty intense chemo and you're feeling terrible and you don't know if it's working. You don't know until after that round, and it takes about a month. I was in the hospital the full month. And then you wait for your results from a bone marrow biopsy and you just don't know. So during that time, you have a lot of time to think that your best days were behind you. You know, you're not feeling good. Chemo's not easy. And you don't know if you're going to feel good again, because if it doesn't work, you might have to try stronger chemo. And, you know, there comes a point where you're going to have to make a decision on whether you want to continue treatment, and you just don't know. So what worked is I had to stop fearing death in the way I had my whole life. So I was always, as a lot of people, and I've talked to a lot of friends of mine about this, what we do is we have like this willing suspension of disbelief. We all know we're going to die, but we just put it out of our minds, except for discrete times when you have to face it, like when a relative dies or a friend dies. And, you know, you have those emotions, and then we tend to just push them away. We actually, as a society, really steer people away from death. When I was young, I never went to any funerals. You know, I was shielded from it.
It's probably part of one of the hardest parts of our business also. Like we, you know, and especially we do a lot of life insurance. It's really something that we hear a lot about. We have a lot of, with our clients, they have death claims or whatnot, something that we're very familiar with. So, it's part of probably the hardest part of the business, the most taxing emotionally for us.
Right.
So really understand it.
If you can get to the point where you can accept the fact that you're going to die and you don't know when, like I was just faced with the idea that it might happen sooner than I'd like it to have, but I stopped worrying about that, and I started thinking about how to pack each day with as much positivity, and not toxic positivity. I'll talk about that very quickly in a second. But spending time with the people I love and doing the things that I love, instead of lamenting or worrying about the fact that I might not be able to do them anymore. And so that took a while for me to truly embrace it. Because at first you hear the saying, you got to fake it till you make it. So once I got to the point where I wasn't worrying every day about whether or not I was going to die, and I did in the beginning, everyone does, I suppose. I mean, I can't get into anyone else's head, but the patients I went through it with, we would talk about that.
It's certainly a very natural reaction.
It like a sort of calmness came over, and it stayed with me to this day, meaning I don't worry about all the stuff, or I don't hide it in parts of my brain or, my psyche, where I would just stuff it away and not deal with it. So I was forced to deal with it, and I was forced to accept that it might actually happen. And I listen, if you knew me 20 years ago, you could have called me, can I curse once?
You can call it curse as much as you want.
Okay.
He cursed like every other
called
second.
me an asshole. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't have thought
very mild cursing. That's a very mild curse, by the way.
I am a very different person.
Even need to ask for permission for that.
I'm a very different person than I was 20 years ago. I'm very different than I was 8 years ago. And Yair, I would argue that I'm a pretty different person from when you and I started working.
Yeah,
even
2 years ago to today is very different.
Yeah.
Night and day.
And each day I work towards that. And as I do, I think the point that we talked about was, I used to think that I was successful because of all of that aggression and all of that packed fear and all of that like intensity. And I will argue that I was successful in spite of that, not because of it. And that was a huge awakening to me, because when you feel like in order to be successful, you have to be constantly hard charging and constantly aggressive and constantly like winning every argument, it's very tiring. And if you're convinced that's the reason why you were successful, you're going to keep doing it, but never see whether or not, wait a second, that's not why you were successful. If anything, it held you back.
I worked for a hedge fund for 7 years before I joined Yair in the business. We all know, we talk about that it's a son-father business. My boss at the PM in that, he came from Cantor at one point. That's what he thought. He would be yelling at everybody. And he thought that that's, like he would hire somebody and a week later they would quit because they couldn't take him yelling. And he would say to me, well, if they can't take my yelling, then then it's not the right fit here. And he would do that across the board. And just like in general, like he was telling me, he's driving into a parking lot in I don't want to say where it was. And some woman with her baby carriage was walking across and he's yelling at her, move out of the way. What's taking you so long? This is what he thought. He thought that was, and in spite of that, I stayed there, not because of it.
Right. And so it can be very deceiving. So I've had my best 3 years work-wise over the last 3 years. And I would argue that part of that, listen, a lot of it has to do with getting to that point in your career, but also, I don't know. I just, I don't stress as much about things that I can't control. We all can't control. If I'm going to get slightly philosophical, we live in an illusion that we control anything. Okay. We don't. Right now, people we love could be injured. I mean, Yair and I spoke. I live in Parkland. My daughter was a senior during the Stoneman Douglas shooting. She's fine, but we know some families that were devastated by it. And I was outside the school, and I'm texting with my daughter, and that lack of control can make you very angry because you can't do anything to help the people that you love. But the reality is that's probably every day.
Well, I would say it's maybe not the anger, but the helplessness that you feel, maybe that, and the frustration leads to that anger.
That's what I meant. That's a better way of putting it. And so when you let go of that, and it takes time, it takes practice. Like I meditate every day, and not everyone's going to buy into the things that I do. You do you, but I don't really get upset like I used to about a whole host of things. And I kind of smile at myself because I know how I would have reacted. And even to this day, sometimes my wife she'll be waiting for it and it doesn't come. And she's like, oh, right. He's he doesn't do that anymore. And I'm like,
it's real. He's actually doing what he said.
And it's funny because she told me she was afraid to tell me something the other day because she thought I'd get really angry. And I was just happy that no one got hurt. And she's like, I'm so relieved. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I used to make you afraid to tell me things,
It's a hard way to live and to be the recipient of that.
It really is. And God knows how I lasted 27 years in marriage this coming September 21st.
It just tells me all about your wife. You just told me everything about your wife I need to know.
She's I know Yair loves my wife. And by the way, here's another piece of advice. If you're going to get married, pick September 21st as your wedding day, because the song from Earth, Wind, and Fire, do you remember the 21st night of summer? I have never forgotten my anniversary.
I can't claim the same thing.
My dad one time got my mom it looked like he thought it was like a vase, but my dad has terrible taste in things. And he got it looked like an urn, and everyone's like, Mom, what'd you get, Mom? And she's still upset. It was like the 33rd anniversary. It was like, what'd you get, Mom? This is bad, Dad. And then he got flowers or something.
No. I just whatever. I got her some good stuff now. I just get the flowers. It's just whatever. I try to remember a few days before if I can.
You got that. By the way, use the calendar feature. I can't tell you how it's a lifesaver for me.
I can't remember to use the calendar feature for that. One time, my oldest son had to remind me, "Isn't your anniversary coming up?" You sure?
He wrote a card to the love of my life or something. I was like, Dad, what happened to you? You were this warrior. He was like you back in the day, really tough. And then all of a sudden,
I was crushed.
He just got, my brother kicked his ass one day and just went.
I have 6 kids. I'm still getting over the trauma.
And then all of a
Wow.
sudden he's changed completely. It's really a big stage. But you guys have actually something very similar together, and or maybe me and you, Paul, have something similar, but my dad had it with your parents. You had a very challenging financial situation as a kid. How did that affect you, and what advice would you take from that to give to others who are going through that?
So it's easy for me to say that in hindsight, it was a blessing in disguise. I mean, I can tell you I did not feel that at the time. I got into some very good universities and I couldn't go to them because I couldn't afford them. So when I found out I was going to go to a SUNY school, which by the way was a completely wrong attitude because SUNY Binghamton was as good as any school. I mean, everyone who went there, I think, couldn't afford to go to where they could have got in. So I was humbled pretty quickly that I was not like any smarter than anyone else there. Um, but what it did is, and here's the thing, and I'm going to make this relate to my kids in a moment. Okay, when I was younger, I didn't think about what my passion was to do. I thought I just need to make enough money to pay for my student loans and then figure it out. Like I didn't take a job I was interested. I took a job that paid the most amount of money because I owed $280,000 when I graduated law school, and so um, it made me very conscious of things that other. The other thing, by the way, is when my parents declared bankruptcy, they improperly listed me as an employee, so I couldn't get any federal loans. So all my loans were private loans, and I don't want to tell you what the interest rate was back in the '90s, over 12%. And
Hard
so
money loans on your student debt.
it was a very difficult time, and I had a lot of resentment and anger. I grew up in Great Neck, which is a very wealthy area, and my friends did not have those issues. And so I had a chip on my shoulder. My dad left when I was about 8 years old, and so I actually don't really watch sports to this day. I play them, and I like beating them when I play, but because I didn't watch with my dad and my mom didn't watch sports, I guess I just resented it. But here's how I'm going to tell you how it had a positive impact. When my daughters decided on where they were going to go to school, I told them something along these lines. I said, listen, most people in the world aren't lucky enough to do their passion as their vocation. Okay. The few that are, it's really great. You see actors and actresses and musicians, and then you'll even see people in other positions where that's always what they've wanted to do. Okay. And they make a good living at it. And that's fantastic. Most of us, however, do a vocation that we find rewarding. And then we do the money we make in our free time to pursue our passions. But you get one chance when you're young to pursue your passion. So my older daughter is a writer and she's getting her master's at Oregon State University and she's teaching. And I said, do everything you can to try to be a writer. If that's your passion, you know, you may not, you may have to go into academia, you may switch careers, but you know, go for the brass ring when you're young and you can. Okay. And my other daughter's an artist and she's going to Ringling, which is an art school, a really good art school in Sarasota. And art school, by the way, is nothing like what it was when we were young. Disney, Pixar, all these they're enmeshed in the school. And the starting salaries of art students is around $160,000 for computer animation alone. So I told them, pursue your passion. And I would tell this to anyone when they're young, even if they had a lot of student loans, because once you get a little older, as you know, because you do the financial planning, your options are limited. You know, it's harder to pursue your passion in your 30s or your 40s. What you can do is hopefully get to a point where you can retire and do your passion if that's what you want to do. And look what you guys are doing. You created a really great company. You've been incredibly instrumental in helping me plan my retirement and switching from an employee to an independent contractor and being able to utilize a whole host of things that I didn't even know I could. And you have a podcast where you've taken it and you're not just doing one thing. It sounds to me like you're doing it as a part of your passion. So that's my advice.
You know, I would just say, you know, when I was growing up also, like my father was an accountant, it's hard. Sometimes you don't have a passion. Sometimes you're 20 or 21 and you don't have a passion. You don't know really. Right now, especially this, when I was in the early 80s, I don't want to date myself, but all right. There was still a lot of availability there. Like, oh, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know where I want to go. My father was an accountant. He told me his whole life how much he hated it. So that's certainly, I'm not going to do that. But what is that going to do? My father was sort of like not really involved. I mean, he was with us. He was he was in the house, but he was not. And I think I find that generation also was sort of like a little bit uninvolved. Never came and talked to me about what would you like to do, like that kind of conversation. So it's not always so straightforward.
No, you're absolutely. Listen, I wouldn't have necessarily. Well, my passion was playing drums. My problem was I was terrible at it. So that was
a little detail.
But what I mean about passion isn't necessarily that you know exactly what it is, but pursue it. Meaning, figure it out. Like, because that's when you have the time to do it. We all don't have that. You're right. Some people don't know what their passion is. Then
it comes later. It comes later.
And I've seen people. There's a great YouTube video I recommend everyone watch called it's a commencement speech called Sunscreen. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
Okay. So if you Google Sunscreen commencement speech, it is a phenomenal real commencement speech that was once. And the advice he dispensed out is both perfect and funny. And it says at one point, some of the most, don't be worried if in your 20s you don't know you don't know what you want to do with your life. He goes, some of the most interesting people I know didn't know what they wanted to do when they were 40 and still don't know what they want to do today. So I don't mean to create this idea that you should know what your passion is, but I would say if you have an inkling that you might want to do something, then go and try to do it or find out about it. But don't worry about whether or not it's going to make you money right away. And if it doesn't, then yes, we all fall back on our vocations to make enough money to do our passions.
No, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, my father was after the Second World War, he came out, he became a CA. It was a CA then, now it's a CPA. He always wanted to be a lawyer for some reason. And like, we're like in our 50s, or he's in his 50s, starts studying for the bar exam. I mean, it's like almost impossible. I mean, how is he going to support us? I mean, that quickly went away. Like he was never really able to get off the ground.
Your mom
He always wanted to do it.
I listen, like you said, I think my daughters have seen my practice from when I was young and have decided they do not want to be lawyers, even though I think they both make excellent lawyers. And so sometimes we react to the circumstances around us.
Yeah. But you're not really just a lawyer. I mean, everything in this conversation, you're really, and I when we were talking earlier, it was really you're a strategist, you're a legal strategist. Like we view ourselves as people go like, you're a financial advisor. Like we're really financial strategists. Like we like strategy. That's much more fun. There's puzzle pieces. How do you move things around? And you were even saying that you will create arguments that not necessarily have existed in the past. You will create something new. And when you're following the path and you're scared, then you will do what has been done before because you can follow the blind.
And that's really when we help people, when we strategize with them, because it's really, there's maybe a couple, but very few people that are able to do it. And people say, oh, wow. I mean, you just clarified and simplified it so easily in a half an hour. You just laid out the whole thing, and nobody ever spoke to me like that before.
Yeah, you're right. Some people call it a consigliere. Some people call it a strategist. What I try to do now is I'm not hired for like the routine work. If there's a bet the company litigation, if there's a sophisticated transaction, if there's something unique and we need to resolve it, those are the things I enjoy the most. Like the harder the problem, the more difficult the issues. It could be utilizing skill sets on who I know. That's very common. Putting people together that otherwise would not have gone together, or coming up with a framework that, you task an outside counsel because they might not want to be responsible for the risky framework, but they will do the work to get it done. So someone needs to come up with it. So earlier I said, it's not about answers. It's about asking the right questions. And that's the hard part. So as a strategist, when you speak with your clients, I'm sure you ask them a lot of questions as to what they want to achieve and really listen to the answers.
We have a little card game that we play. I don't know if Yair's played it with you or not.
I'll play with
Not
you
yet.
another time. Another
Oh,
time.
you're missing out. You're missing out.
Yeah, you'll like it.
I'm looking forward to it. But it
Not
is
exciting.
it's really learning and understanding what their needs are, and then trying to come. Like, I spend a lot of my day thinking about how to resolve the issues that I'm working on. And because I don't charge by the hour, I'm not sitting there worried about, how much time I'm putting into it. It's really a great relief for me, by the way. I think lawyers charging by the hour is the most unintuitive thing in the world, and I can explain it in 2 seconds. As a lawyer, you get better the more you practice, right? Which means that you can do things faster, right? So how do lawyers make their money? They bill by time. So a lawyer that can do something better and faster makes less money than a lawyer who can't do it as good and as fast. And does that make any sense? No. So what do? They raise their hourly rates. But the client doesn't understand that it's going to take less time for that more expensive lawyer, so that it isn't as expensive as having a less qualified lawyer.
Or the lawyer just takes more time also and just charges more also.
Which is what the client thinks, okay? But that concept is very flawed. Now, there are firms out there like Wachtell and others that do not use that model, okay? And it's becoming more common not to use that model, or to negotiate with your outside law firms to offer them equity, or to offer them an opportunity that is outside the traditional billing arrangement. And a lot of tech firms, tech law firms in California do this, and they've made fortunes doing it. You can do that. You don't have to wait. If you have a small practice, or if you go out on, you can do these things. And of course, you're probably in your head saying, I can't do that. You absolutely can. If you represent a small company that you think has a lot of potential, you can negotiate that. No question about it. And if you really want to put in the time, don't bill them for everything you're doing. Show them the value of the advice, and then they will ask you to do the work for them. And that's what happened to me about 6, 7, 8 years ago. I started to get calls, and I really thought I was going to retire. I certainly thought I was done when I got leukemia. Those are my 2 biggest years. And I will tell you, working is what kept me sane.
So I can tell you that the mechanic I like the most is the one that'll fix that small problem for free.
I will often consult for a client for over a month before I give them a retainer. And they'll ask me why. And I'll say, first, I want to say if we're a good fit. Second, I want to understand if I can add value and how. And third, I want to show you that value before I charge you for it, so that by the time I send you a retainer letter, you are very happy to sign it. And that it is a whole different, like, I can't tell you how the clients, it's so refreshing to them to get that. And there's been times where I'm like, you don't need me. You don't. I'll help you with this one problem, but you don't need me on an ongoing basis. But I want
to. Sometimes I'll tell somebody, you don't need so much life insurance. What? What do you mean? I don't need so much? No,
we're too expensive to do on Fidelity. We do that a lot. Just go to Fidelity. Like, just leave us alone. You don't need us. It's ridiculous. But
because you want to give what's best for your client, but sometimes they're going to make a decision that you don't necessarily agree with. So I'm not going to be part of that, though. So what I'll say is, I'm going to refer you to another firm, and I'll stay involved, but I'm not the right fit for you here. And turning away work as a lawyer is like, how could you turn away work? You better turn away work, because you're going to have some unethical clients. You're going to have clients that will push the envelope, and I have a sleep at night factor that is absolutely inflexible.
Or take advantage of your time and take advantage of you.
Oh God, yes. I mean, yes, there are clients, and during that free month, try to max out what I'll do. But it all works out in the end. And the thing is, I don't get upset about it anymore. I'm not all Zen. Trust me. I get annoyed in traffic like anyone else. But
no, I don't believe that.
I don't let.
Not in Florida.
Oh God. Well, in Florida, here's the difference. In New York, traffic is a dead stop. In Florida, it's 45 miles an hour. Just in Florida. Have you ever heard the term Q-tips? Oh, you're going to like.
Well, yeah, I know the legal.
No, yeah, oh, you're right.
Yeah,
I'm speaking to the wrong.
okay.
So what a Q-tip is in Florida, if you're driving behind a car, it's particularly like a late model American
All you
car,
see is the white hair.
little tufts of white hair. So what I do, and my wife taught me this, just pretend it's my grandmother. Yes, but how would I treat my grandmother if you're driving in front of
Oh,
me?
they're off
And then I
aggressively.
take a deep breath and I don't get mad, even though they're going like 8 miles an hour.
Smart,
Eight sometimes is
smart,
good.
smart. So, Paul, thank you so much for giving so much of yourself today and giving all of our audience really some tremendous value. And that's really what we try to do, and change the perspective of people that are stuck in this world and trying to get to the next level. Where can people find you? Where can people get connected to you? Where can people just like what would be good plug for you, so people can find you?
If anyone wants to find me, I have a website. It's one page. It's the simplest website you'll ever see, because I really don't do any promotion. But it's plr-law.com.
I didn't know you had a website, honestly.
Yeah, well, I don't really talk about it. But in order to get a domain name to have an email address, you need to have a website.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know that. So
Yeah.
I have but if you go to plr-law.com, if for any reason anyone wants to reach me, and I actually don't mind, if someone has a question, or if there's a young, attorney out there who, wants to talk, I would, lend my time as much as I could.
Right. Paul, thank you so much for everything
Thank
you
you.
do. It's been amazing to hear your story. It's amazing to hear where you've gone to, and you could even tell that you're just so like you're successful, but you're just happy about it. It's just part of your life, and it's really great.
Thank
It's really amazing to see the energy, and I think that's something that we really took away from today. Thank you everybody for listening. We'll see you on the next one, and make sure to stay connected with Paul if you have questions. If you need some mentors, try to reach out to Paul, see if he'll take you on, but you never know.